about humanism contra nihilism. As our society becomes increasingly dominated by technology, market logics, and commodified culture, what has happened to the ideals of humanism, democracy, and equality? Michael is professor of political theory in the Department of Political Science, William Patterson University, and is the founding editor of the quarterly journal Logos, a journal of modern science, society and culture. He's also the author of The Politics of Inequality, The Domestication of Critical Theory, and the forthcoming, we'll be looking for it, The Spectre of Babel, a reconstruction of political judgment. And this talk is based on his book that he's currently writing, The Disenchantment of the Good, Ethical Life in the Age of Nihilism. And you might want to consider doing your book launch here, Michael. In the meantime, welcome. And you can adjust this. I know you're taller than I am, so.
Thank you. Hi, good morning. Thanks for coming out on a nice summer day. Can you hear me?
You might want to.
Height. Oh, it's mechanized.
Good.
All right, how's that better? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. I'll try to project a little more too, so that you can, just to help out. Yeah, the talk I want to give today is, and I want to make it as compact as possible because I'd really prefer to converse about things and hear back and forth. I've never been a fan of the kind of hierarchical lecture given to people. I actually, the book that I just completed this summer and should be out in 2020 was my first attempt at trying to grapple with this, what I'm calling this idea of the cybernetic society. And I want to talk about that a little bit because I think many of us might have an immediate association of the idea of cybernetics with the internet and social media and things like this. But actually, in truth, the concept of cybernetics, the word cybernetic, is not really necessarily, doesn't really have anything to do with the internet or any of these things. What I really see as, and the more and more time goes by, the more firmly I'm convinced of this, that the problems of our contemporary world, of our culture, is really a problem of nihilism. And that means, and not only, it means first and foremost, what nihilism has always meant, the idea that there are no moral values, there are no ethical values. But I think modern nihilism is a little more pernicious than the nihilism, say, of the late 19th century. And the nihilism of today is a kind of passive acceptance of the way the world operates. A passive acceptance of the institutions that effectively govern our world. Humanism, I'm going to suggest toward the end, can only survive if it becomes a political conception, not just an ethical conception, but has to transform the world, the actual organization of power and social relations that we have. Because, as I think most of us know if we read the newspaper, the modern world that we have inherited and we continue to construct is destroying the environment, nature, society, and human beings. And I think this is only going to increase. I'm generally, when I talk about this stuff, people really don't like to hear it because they think it's far too negative. It's pessimistic and despairing. But I don't think that's true. I actually think we really need to have a proper grasp of how really sinister the kind of world that we live in is before we're going to respond to it properly. So let me talk a little bit about this concept of the cybernetic society before we talk about even anything with nihilism. As I see it, what's happening today is it has been growing since the 18th century. So it's a long process. in our culture, in our civilization. And it's spreading outward. Starts in Europe, Western Europe, but it has been spreading outward ever since. And it's a kind of conflict between two concepts of enlightenment. The Enlightenment comes in the 18th century, mainly in Western European countries. It's an openness to the ideas of science, of rationalism, critique of tradition and authority, ideas of democracy, common interest, equality, freedom, emancipation from domination. We know about this stuff. But what's really happened, I think, especially during the course of the 20th century, the latter half of the 20th century, is that there's been a split in this Enlightenment culture. That the ideals of science, technology, quantification, mathematics, etc., has been separated from the humanist ideas of the Enlightenment. Ideas about equality, of justice, emancipation. And what's happening is the world is actually being transformed by this first force of the Enlightenment. And that is the domination by quantification, mechanization, technology, mass production. And what this means is that as this increases, and by the way, if you travel at all to places that maybe even 30 years ago were not really touched by globalization, you will see today that they have adopted, in many ways, the technological, productive, and managerial techniques of modernity, but they resist the Enlightenment values of modernity. You can see what's happening now in Hong Kong as an example of this. This is a clash between these two forces, I would suggest to you. Hong Kong, which is a place which is trying to defend democratic values of emancipation, equality, and a resistance to domination. And China, which embraces the quantification of mass production, technology, has no problem with the Enlightenment with respect to technological, economic values, but resists completely humanistic and democratic values. I think that's the first aspect of this. And that's really significant because not only is that the way the Enlightenment has been spreading out through globalization, but it's also impacting the origins of the Enlightenment. In other words, Western cultures that have had these traditions about democracy and so on are also now seeing an erosion of these values. I mean, just looking around today, not today right here, but you know what I mean. The politics are absolutely abysmal, not only in the United States, but in most Western European countries. So you could say to yourself, okay, well, no, this is a phase. This happens. There's always a swing back. This is the common way we rationalize and justify things. I don't think that's true at all. I think that this first, I call it the first face of the Enlightenment. This is quantification, technology, the commitments to economic rationalism and mass production and mass consumption. These are the dominant paradigms and institutions of what I'm calling the cybernetic society. Now, what does that mean? The word cybernetics, actually, it's a Greek word, kubernetikos, and in ancient Greek. And the word really means, the word was used to mainly in navigational vocabulary. In other words, the kubernetikos, the cyberneticist was the pilot of the ship. The cyberneticist was the one who steered where the ship went. And the ship wasn't just a ship. The ship had oarsmen. The ship had people who did the rigging and did the sails. And all the people on the ship were steered by the pilot. So the word kubernetikos, where we get the modern word cybernetics, really is about the concept of steering others. The Latin translation of the Greek word kubernetikos is gubernatos, where we get the word government, to govern. The word is, in effect, if you trace its etymology back, the word is a concept of power. It's a concept of hierarchy, of power, of control, and of systems. The important thing is to remember that if you read any Greek philosophy, for example, almost all the time, Plato and Aristotle always do this. They always use the metaphor of the ship to talk about society, because each person has their part. Oh, the person's doing the oaring. Then what's the purpose of the ship? To bring goods to another port. And then there's the pilot, and he's steering the ship. This is always a metaphor that they use for government, for politics. Something's happened, though. I think cybernetic society today has been affected and transformed by these processes I told you from the Enlightenment. Quantification, hierarchy, and most important, here's where I'm getting at the thing with nihilism. Those of us who have been transformed and socialized by these institutions are facing a crisis in our capacity for autonomous, critical, individual thought. We are being absorbed into a system, metaphorically, a machine. Absorbed into economic systems, political systems, that we as individuals no longer have control over. And it's not just that we don't have control over them. We have surrendered much of our critical reflective capacities as individuals to the steering powers of these systems and mechanisms. I was reading East of Eden over the winter break by John Steinbeck. And right in the middle of the novel, there's this just wonderful passage. I'm going to read it because I think it's kind of sums where this comes together. And it says, "This I believe, that the free, exploring mind of the individual human is the most valuable thing in the world. And this I would fight for, the freedom of the mind to take any direction it wishes, undirected. And this I must fight against, any idea, religion, or government which limits or destroys the individual. This is what I am and what I am about. I can understand why a system built on a pattern must try to destroy the free mind, for that is one thing which can by inspection destroy such a system. Surely I can understand this, and I can hate it, and I will fight against it to preserve the one thing that separates us from the uncreative beasts. If the glory can be killed, we are lost." It's a wonderful passage. Why? Because the thing that really, not only this great passion about this kind of defense of the concept of the individual, is great, but Steinbeck actually does identify this idea of what? He calls it why a system built on a pattern must try to destroy the free mind. The pattern is the important word. The pattern is the cybernetic society. The patterning of everyday life, the patterning of every commodity that we consume, the pattern of mass culture, the pattern of news media, the pattern of every day you go to work or go to school and have the same type of blueprinted, hierarchical organization which we passively accept as individuals. This, I would suggest to you, has a deep impact on who we are as individuals. And Steinbeck kind of makes this clear, because he basically says this idea that the system is built on a pattern, it must erode the self. Add technology to this. Add technology to this. The concept of technology. And the French sociologist, a guy named Jacques Ellul, wrote a great book called The Technological Society back in the early 1960s. It's a great book, and it really should be reread again. Of course, but people aren't reading anymore. You don't need to. Cybernetic society. You get the news, you just turn on your phone. The news is there for you. I don't need to make an effort. I don't need to go out and figure out, learn about new books, etc. Not necessarily, again, this crowd, but definitely in my classroom. Reading is dead. Experience is dead. The idea of the individual is dying. You could see it before you. Jacques Ellul says, we really need to know what technology means. Not the face of technology, how we interact with it. Weird bunnies and things like this on the telephone. He says, no, technology is when everything has been measured and calculated mathematically so that the method which has been decided upon is satisfactory from the rational point of view, the method is manifestly the most efficient of all those hitherto employed, of those in competition with it, then the technical movement becomes self-directing. I call this process automatism. Self-directing. What happens? When you discover the most efficient means of achieving goal X, that means becomes essentially autonomous. What does that mean? That means that those rules and norms and institutions have a kind of self-propelling quality. We simply get absorbed into them, recreate them passively, and then new people take our place. This is this first element of the cybernetic society. And you know, in 1950, there's another great book that was, I think is a great book, written by the father of cybernetic theory in mathematics, Norbert Wiener. And he wrote a book in 1950 called The Human Use of Human Beings. And I think there's a passage worth mentioning here, because this is actually what Norbert Wiener was trying to warn against. He wasn't trying to defend this view. He says, when I give an order to a machine, the situation is not essentially different from that which arises when I give an order to a person. In other words, as far as my consciousness goes, I am aware of the order that has gone out and the signal of compliance that has come back. To me personally, the fact that the signal in its intermediate stages has gone through a machine rather than through a person is irrelevant and does not in any case greatly change my relation to the signal. It is the purpose of cybernetics to develop a language and techniques that will enable us indeed to attack the problem of control and communication in general, but also to find the proper repertory of ideas and techniques to classify their particular manifestations under certain concepts. This is also insightful. Now the cybernetic society, at least as far as I can understand it, can be seen. The idea is that compliance, whether it's a machine or a person, if I turn my computer on, it should go on. If I double click my icon for Facebook, Facebook should appear, correct? And those of us who are like really get annoyed at our computer because I'm clicking the thing and it's not working, or I turn this thing on and it's not going on, get frustrated. Why? Because the signal has not been, it's not obeying me. I told you to go here and do this, and you're not doing it. We look at machines as passive tools, instruments, extensions of our power. But what Norbert Wiener is saying, that a cybernetic system can be created where the order I give to a machine will be the same as the order I give to a person. That the compliance will be the same. Get up at 8 o'clock and go to a meaningless job. Yes. You know, don't read the newspaper. Do what the people in popular culture tell you to do. At whatever the ambient value is. The idea of cybernetics is therefore now, if I'm making any sense at all, a synthesis of technology and power. And what I want to suggest to you is the result of this is an erosion of the self, an erosion of the individual, and the most important value, one of the most important values of humanism that Steinbeck was passionately trying to defend is the concept of autonomy, of individuality, creativity, curiosity, and most importantly of all, criticism. Criticism of power. Criticism of power that is not as simple as it was 200 years ago. It was easy in France, it's easy to say this now, in 1789 to say, these guys are the cause of all the problems. It's the Pope, it's the king, it's these aristocrats. Get rid of them, we'll have a free society. That's not going to work now. It's a system. So, what's nihilism then? I think nihilism is the result of this cybernetic society. And I think there's two kinds of nihilism that pervade our world. Maybe there's more, but as far as I can identify, there are two strong forms of nihilism. The first I'm going to call passive nihilism. And passive nihilism is the kind of nihilism that says, what can I do about it? Yes, I don't like the way the government is or the way the politics are. There's nothing I can do about this. I'm just going to live my life. These are my students. Almost to the one. We'll read political theory. We'll read Hobbes. We'll read Marx. We'll read Locke. We'll read Rousseau. You read Kant. And they're like, this is great, but there's nothing we can do about it. So what's the point? Why do we even read this? Why even get excited about it? There's nothing we can do. Passive nihilism. Passive nihilism is reading every day about the glaciers melting. Caring is not enough. The idea that you're not even committed to the ideals of civil participation in civic life. This is a fundamental feature of passive. And most importantly, what results from passive nihilism is a form of amorality. You literally begin to become amoral. The sociologist Emil Durkheim has this great line. He was talking about the emergence of industrial civilization in the 19th century, the spread of factories and factory systems. And he says, and he makes this great insight. He says, how can we live amorally for 12 hours a day in a factory at work, and then expect to go outside and back into the real world and have any kind of moral consciousness at all? It's impossible, he says. The institutions of our lives, work, school, if you think about it, are fundamentally built on hierarchical, anti-democratic forms of life. I went to public school, went to public university for undergraduate and graduate school, had jobs before I became a university professor. And I have to admit, there's not one place, not one sphere of my life where I participated in something that was democratic, reciprocal, or in some way egalitarian. Family, hierarchical, at least mine was. School, hierarchical. Work, hierarchical. Even me here, hierarchical. People come and listen to you talk. These structures erode the self and create a system of passive nihilism. The second one, perhaps, is even worse, and this I call malignant nihilism. And malignant nihilism is a form of violence against the world. Malignant nihilism is a kind of, the world is devoid of meaning, the world is meaningless, and therefore I can do with it what I want. I can kill, hunt, murder, and it's okay. People are no longer people, they are objects. They are things. They're subhuman. Racism, mass shootings, destruction of the environment, aggression, all are features of what I'm going to call malignant nihilism. So, in many ways, it's the anxiety and despair that emerges from the cybernetic society that creates the nihilism, both passive and malignant. The fact that all values have to be gutted from our culture. Why? Because of what Norbert Wiener had basically said. The imperative of our institutions, the imperative of a technological, administrative capitalist society is the securing of compliance within the hierarchy. And that fundamental is what Steinbeck wants to defend as the individual. This is the patterned world, the patterned life. But it's not just power in the raw sense of the term. Not just power in the sense that I get you to do what I want you to do. That's great. I also have to do something further. The cybernetic society has to also take away not only your everyday autonomy, your everyday independence. It has to do this. But more importantly, and this is a lesson it learned, I think, from the 1960s, the cultural counter-rebellion of the 1960s, it has to capture culture. It has to commodify and pattern culture. Everyone has to walk around with the headphones, with the pre-recorded patterned music. Everyone having the identically same experience. It's wonderful to have come in here to have someone playing a piano and actually singing. Music experienced authentically, as opposed to mass production of film. And films are terrible now. I mean, I don't know if you've seen what goes on in cinema. This is absolutely the same thing over and over and over again. Why? Because the idea of hope, the idea of utopia, is a fundamentally critical capacity for any individual to have, because it posits an alternative to what already exists. I don't know if any of you know, there's a German philosopher from the 20th century named Ernst Bloch. He wrote this great 3-volume work called The Principle of Hope. And he's got this fundamental concept of utopia, which he calls anticipatory illumination. And anticipatory illumination is kind of effectively this idea that says, what's the function of utopia? It's to think about, you always have in your mind the fact that there could be something better than what you have. It serves a fundamental way of criticizing the world that you're in. But what if I'm able to eliminate this? What if I'm able to eliminate the experience of music, of art, of literature, of philosophy, of the curiosity of science as opposed to its domination by technology? Then what I have done effectively is eliminate from the individual hope. I have flattened the individual into the system. Again, securing compliance and stability of the system. Here I was watching the other night, my wife had not seen the movie Network, and I'd seen it years ago. I said, you know what, I haven't seen it in a long time, and they're doing a Broadway version of it, or at least they were. So I said, we should probably watch this movie. And we watched it the other night, and I'm just struck, because I hadn't seen it in about 10 years, about how this film captures this transformation in media and culture. How literally it's about not just giving people entertainment, but patterning an experience. And patterning an experience in the service of what our entire society is organized around, or becoming more and more organized around, which are the imperatives and values of economic surplus and economic gain. I know this is the classic kicking bag, but it's true. The values, the reason. Another book I read this summer, which was really kind of, was a book about how the modern industrial practices of industrial management in 20th century industrial society were patterned off of the slave system. That under slavery there were these very elaborate forms of management and accounting and hierarchical organization and theories about management. It's incredible. I had no idea this was the case. And there were these manuals, if you were a slave owner, about how you would organize your slaves with others and have people in all these different hierarchically complex intermediary positions of power and accountability, and effectively, this became the kind of roadmap for 20th century industrial organization. It's all the same in effect, right? Whether it's what you're producing, doesn't matter, the widget, it doesn't make a difference. The important thing in a mass society is order, stability, and the securing of that power. So, yeah, I think me talking about it makes me even more depressed. Sometimes like reading and thinking about it, I'm like, oh, this is really screwed up. And as I can talk about it, I think, this is really pretty bad.
Give us some hope.
Yes, give us some hope, right. Okay, so what I'd like to do is say to you, okay, if we look at the beast for what it really is, then what is the hope? I think, honestly, I actually think that unless humanism, let me just add a footnote here to say why I'm making this point. For those of you, who, if you know anything about academic kind of theory and political theory, humanism is on the outs. Humanism is considered ethnocentric. It is considered traditionalistic. And if you're really politically progressive, you consider yourself an anti-humanist. This is the left. This is the left. And believe me, I'm not trying to say you have to change left political theory to change the world, because that is definitely not the case. But if the rot has gone up that far, then there has to be a radical rethinking of how humanistic values are spread. And one of the things is that, I want to at least suggest is I think we have to actually, what I've been thinking about is a kind of rethinking of what the roots of humanism are, not as a philosophy, well, maybe as a philosophy, I guess. We really need to turn humanism into a fundamentally political doctrine. There is absolutely no way that ethics alone, first of all, I would actually suggest to you that ethics themselves are political inherently. Ethics, not in the sense of abstract values, but kind of like what I'm talking to the wrong audience for this, because you know this, ethical values as embodied in the ways of life, in the actual ways that we organize our societies and our relations with others. And this has to become fundamentally a part of any kind of dialogue about progressive politics that are going on in the United States. And right now I don't see this. Right now what I see is identity politics and kind of maybe at best it's liberalism, not the kind of ethical humanism that's required. So what I wanted to at least suggest at the very end here is the idea to think about humanism as rooted in who we are as a species. In other words, to say that, and I think there's three core features, three things that we can think about, that I've been thinking about, that kind of serve as the groundwork for what humanism should be, not only its set of values, but also what its paradigm is for transforming and critiquing the world, cybernetic society, etc., whatever it is. The first is to understand that our species is fundamentally a relational species, that we fundamentally are relational. Our relations that we have, the structure and shape of the relations that we create and construct, form who we are as individuals. That leads to my second fundamental feature of what it means to be a human being, which is that we are processual beings. In other words, we are fundamentally evolving through time. We are fundamentally created and articulated, or basically structured by the relationships that we possess. And third, we are fundamentally purposeful beings. These three things mark us off uniquely, I think, from nature and from spirit. It does not mean that we're superior, but it means that we have a distinctive capacity for purposes and meaning. And in this respect, if you take these three things together, because relations and processes and purposes all constitute fundamentally the nucleus of what it means to be a human being. And what that means is, I think, we can identify the defective ways that our world is put together and promote more enhancing ways for us to put our world together. Relations, an example that, a value of, so you could say we are relational beings. We have associations with others. We're fundamentally social beings. This is Aristotle's great insight. We're like political animals and social beings. But just because we're social beings does not mean that every relation we have, every association we belong to, is necessarily good. How do we know what's good from what is defective? Good promotes the individual development of the individual member of that relationship or that association. So associations that are hierarchical, associations that are built on, say, dependence or slavery, are effectively defective because the purpose of our associations should be our common good. The purpose of our relations with others should be the mutual reciprocal benefit. If I'm married to somebody, husband or wife, or husband and husband, wife and wife, one of them does that, or one of them is subordinate to me, then the very purpose of that marriage, the very purpose of that institution is defective. No human beings should be involved in relations where they are not mutually beneficial, benefit from that association. And I think any relationship that violates that should be considered as fundamentally invalid. That's the first political step that humanism can make. And the second is processual. Any process that we belong to. School is a process. Yes, there are relations, teachers and students, but there's also a process. There are practices and norms. There's things that you have to do. If those practices and norms of any institution, I don't care if it's school, I don't care if it's work, I don't care if it's family life, if those are exploitive rather than mutually beneficial, those institutions, norms, practices, values, etc., are also should be seen as invalid and worthy of criticism and opposition. And last, the purposes. Each one of us personally may have purposes in our life, a meaning, an end that we work toward, but most likely we belong to an organization, a job, a school, and our roles are part of a cog of a machine, the machine of which is to do X. If the purpose of that machine, the purpose of that organization, is not the common good of the community as a whole, it should be seen not only as anti-humanistic, but worthy of dissent, disobedience, and criticism. I'm asking a lot. Passive nihilism makes us say, you know what, I've got my apartment, I've got my 401, $1 million in my pension fund, I got a summer home, I can have my values, that's fine. Like, it's not. Humanism must migrate into a political conception. Cybernetic society will eventually, if it's not contested, the cybernetic society will push out all of the values that we maintain as humanists. It will do so. It will push it out because there's something, a new dark age could potentially be on the horizon. And I mean a dark age similar culturally to what we were talking about with the fall of the Roman Empire. A loss of access to these ideas. They lost the language of Latin. We're just losing the whole idea that reading is even a worthy phenomenon. And if you don't know younger people, if you don't have them in your family or teach them or whatever, like search it out and find out. Generally speaking, curiosity, intellect, these values of humanism are being degraded. And I really think, I'll tell you, what's happening in Hong Kong and some other places also, this is the kind of disobedience to authority, hierarchical authority, that a truly democratic society has to hold at its center. Because democracy is another kind of zinger for you. Democracy, I believe, is already spreading into oligarchy. I really think that we are living, this administration is the closest to the pure theory of oligarchy that the Greeks could have ever come. They are business CEOs in the head of each form of government. This is a classical Greek oligarchy. And if you think we're going to come out of this, first of all, if Donald Trump is reelected, even if he's not, there's been a fundamental cultural shift. A move toward nihilism, a move toward oligarchy, a move toward more hierarchy, and cruder hierarchy than people like John Kenneth Galbraith were identifying in the 1960s. In the great book, The New Industrial State, which is a wonderful book, is at the end it's like, if democracy doesn't get its act together, the values of the business community are going to become the values of every institution of society. That was 63, I think, 63, 64. And it's true. The values of the business community are the values of almost every subsystem within society. Humanism has to, therefore, I would suggest to you again, become a political idea. It has to orient, it has to look at the relations of the structure of the associations that we participate in, interrogate them for their purposes. And I would suggest to you the classical idea. If I go back to Aristotle, if I go back to Cicero, these great first articulators of a kind of political and ethical humanism. The common interest, the common good of the community should be the sole and highest purpose of our efforts. And the reason for that is, and this is often criticized as communitarian or something, but that's not what they meant. And Plato says this in the Republic, and it's worth talking about this. The reason that the common good should be the highest good is because from that, individuals become the best individuals. You defend the individual by defending the common interest, by defending these values. Then the individual can flourish. So I'll end with that and perhaps take some questions. Thank you.
Did you want to take some questions, Mike?
Of course, yeah, please.
Of course.
Yeah, that'd be great. That's okay. I think that's working.
Do you mind if I start?
Please, go ahead, sure.
We were basically talking about education, and that's where it's starting now too. I mean, there's been endless complaints about humanity, liberal arts courses all being knocked out of the programs. And the threat is basically, this is how you get a job, is through these other programs. And also with the sense of power, there is the control held by money. Everything is money. So whether you're talking about this is better for your job as you go forward, or your career, or whether I'm president because I have money behind me and all of these businesses. So there's like the threat of punishment always. If you're going in the other direction, you won't have money, you won't have a job. That's as far as I'm going.
Yeah, and I think that this actually points even stronger in the direction that I really want to go in, which is that the democratization of wealth. And this is an American struggle from the very beginning. This isn't a Bernie Sanders thing. This goes back to the founding of the country. That the idea that if wealth is not democratized or in some way accountable to the public, that democracy will wither. And what you say is true. The STEM program, the whole movement towards STEM, my university, where students really aren't prepared. It's a working class, kind of university, state university. And they terrify them. They can't handle STEM programs. They just don't have the mathematical ability. They don't have the ability to compete. And so what do? They start dropping out. Universities, colleges are closing. All these private, maybe you've seen this throughout the last year in the New York Times, all these private schools, these small schools, that's where it starts, they start closing. And next it's going to be like the smaller state schools. Because people are like, what's the point? I can't get a job. I'm going to be a barista anyway. Why am I going to go into debt? I'm going to have to borrow $100,000 even to go to state school. It's fear. Fear is how you keep, Hobbes knew this, fear is how you keep people in line. And I think that is, you can't change the educational, you can't educate people from within this system through the educational institution alone. It has to be broader, because that's not what's going on in school.
I thought your talk was just brilliant, and I wish my hearing was better. I'd love to read what you wrote, but one of the things that occurs to me is that the Arab Spring, the Occupy Wall Street, so many of the and what's happening now in Russia and Sudan and many other places. There is a revolt, Hong Kong. There is a revolt, but in the Arab Spring particularly, there was an organization So you're talking about hierarchy, but I think politically you have to have a hierarchy to undo all the things that you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm not against hierarchy in and of itself, but that's why I said the question is what the purposes of those relations are. You're going to have a hierarchy which is democratic. I voted you to be in for a year and see what happens. That's fine because there's some accountability to that power. But when hierarchy becomes passively accepted and its purposes are merely exploitive of its members and outside, that's when it does violence. And by the way, the thing about Arab Spring was, I'm really happy you brought that up. The question isn't so, people want to talk about movements. They want to say like, oh, there's something happening in Hong Kong, there's something, the Arab Spring happened, so did Occupy Wall Street. That's true. Marx, the great theorist of revolution, actually knew what you need to look at is not just the revolution, but the counter-revolution. You have to look at both. You're only looking at one side of the story. Arab Spring failed. Now you have the authoritarian institutions that have come back because of the counter-revolt are worse than what they were when they... The same thing happened in 1848 in Europe. 1848 revolutions failed, and there was a 50-year period of counter-revolution. The 1960s failed. And 1980 is the great year of counter-revolution, of neoliberal counter. We've been living in it ever since. Cultural conservatism, cultural apathy, and an acceptance of, I mean, I'm sorry, but if America's such a liberal place, you know, we've had like 2 Democratic presidents since 1980. And they get worse, each one gets worse. So the counter-revolution is just as important to look at as, and when, I don't know what's going to happen in Hong Kong, obviously, but if there's another 1989, another Tiananmen Square in Hong Kong, then that's it, that's going to be it in China. Because in 1989 in Tiananmen Square, there was also a major demonstration throughout the whole country. Beijing was the focal point of it, but it was everywhere. Workers, students wanted democratic transformation. And when they cracked down, I lived in China for 2 years in the mid-1990s, no one knew what Tiananmen Square was. The counter-revolution was complete, culturally, institutionally, and politically. That's the fear. Occupy Wall Street, a memory. A memory.
Not true.
I would tell you,
They're coming back this year.
I hope they do, but they better have a program and something that's going to actually change, because the movements need I think that's your point. Movements need that hierarchy.
Judy?
Michael, first, thanks for a very interesting, thoughtful address. You've given us a lot to chew on. My question is, when in our history did our populace have individual reflective thought?
You know, one of the movements that I think back on, actually, is, talk about a movement, is, which starts out small and ends up actually doing something big over time, was the anti-slavery movement. The idea of individual conviction about the wrongness of slavery starts out, the first anti-slavery society in the United States, I think it's in 1835, meets, I think in Baltimore, I don't remember where it meets, or Philadelphia. 21 people were members of that organization. As it grows, you have people writing novels, you have Uncle Tom's Cabin, you have people writing plays, you have people writing addresses, you have people agitating, and this actually becomes a political platform by the time the Republican Party forms. So, I mean, the idea is not that individual thought completely gets eliminated. The question whether or not our individual convictions and autonomy have public force, have public impact. And I see as paradigmatic is the anti-slavery movement. I think that's one of them. There's others. There's the labor movement, there's the women's rights movement, there's a whole bunch of others. But this is a movement that said all human beings should be free, all human beings should be emancipated. And it captured people who were artists, who were just common people, who were religious leaders, who were political theorists. And I think that's kind of paradigmatic. It's where individual conviction translates into public force.
I think we have time for two more, so Monica, and then we saw David.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put a different frame on this, and it won't surprise anyone here. I believe the next big disruptor is coming in the form of a global youth climate movement. And this is challenging the status quo. Climate change being the biggest existential threat to all life on the planet, not just humans. And interestingly, it's challenging this entire hierarchy that you spoke about, because it is not patriarchal. It is led by young women and girls. It is not top-down, it is bottom-up. It's being led by children who understand that the biggest threat to their lives and their futures is climate change. And they understand the intersection of that with economy, power structure, everything. So do you want to just speak to that for a moment? This is happening. It's happening already.
So I actually was thinking a lot about that also, because I really think that is one of those movements that can really embrace this idea of that common good, common interest, social justice, the idea that people can have rights that aren't yet born. That, you have this concept of generational rights, that you say you have to do things now because the common good is not just about people who are alive now, but people who are not yet alive. And also it shows how I think humanism embraces what is the non-human. Nature, the environment, these are values about how we relate not only to ourselves, right? So we're relational beings, not just to ourselves, but relational to nature, to animals. These are humane values. My hope is that obviously that grows into something like that. What I get depressed about, and again, this is depends on the cohort you're around. My students vary, and this is going over years and years of teaching on this. These are regular working kind of American families. And they fall into these two categories, the passive or the malignant nihilist. The passive nihilist is like, it's horrible what's happening. The polar bears and the ice, they hate it, they can't stand it. So what do? They don't watch the news. And there's the malignant nihilist in the class. It's like, they're just animals. They're just forests, they're there for us to cut them down. What's the matter with you? This is for our benefit. I'm not gonna have air conditioning, I'm not gonna be able to drive around. I'd rather have that. I'd rather my life's more important than this. Is this the majority? I don't know what the majority is. But if a movement's going to be real, it has to overcome that. Because the danger of all movements is that they get absorbed into the system. They get domesticated. This is what happens. And if it can avoid that trap, then I think there's really hope. But I do agree that morally and politically there's potential with that movement, yes.
So we have time for one more. Eleanor?
I may be having a slow day, but I didn't really follow. It seems to me as soon as we use the word society, humans in some kind of an aggregate, that there is hierarchy, there is pattern. And at the outset of what you were saying, you were talking about all the negatives of that, and to me, the opposite of hierarchy and pattern is chaos and anarchy. I also thought that to have a society based on humanism sounds wonderful, but that doesn't mean that humanism hasn't been built into other societies, and the aspirations of humanism were there. They're in our Constitution and Declaration. It's how do you marry that? How do you marry humanism with the economic system? Does it go better with socialism than with capitalism?
Okay, that's great.
Oh, and the last.
Go ahead.
The last,
Number
I'm
3.
sorry.
That's fine.
You talked about passive nihilists, malignant nihilists. We're the activists there. We're not nihilists. It's not that we're just either passive or malignant. And I would hope that some of your students fall into the other category, constructive activists.
Yeah, so let me take the third question, work back. The categories of passive nihilism and malignant nihilism are just about those who suffer from nihilism. It's not the entire culture. For sure, that's true. And yes, I do have students who have gone on, become very politically active and activists and constructivists and things, and that's wonderful. And maybe that's just the way it is. You're not going to get everyone to become individually critical. But there's just I think that the pendulum has swung that there's too big of a kind of passivity in the face of these cybernetic powers of society. That when I was in college, I felt this too. I felt that the students that I went to university in the 1990s as an undergraduate, and I was at a very large university, and I felt like there was very few people who shared the kind of passions and interests in what was human and humane and aesthetic and philosophy and curiosity. And I do think actually that there is a precipitous decline in this in our culture, and it's going to have a major impact politically. And then let me go back to the idea of the opposite is pattern and chaos. It is true that simplistically speaking, there's pattern and then there's chaos. I think you're right about that. The question is whether the pattern is externally placed upon us, or whether the pattern that we live under is created by us in the sense of democratically. I can say to myself, look, if we were trapped on a desert island somewhere, I may not be the best person to lead you. It may be that we have to have a vote and say, like, this is the best person to do this and this best person to do that. But that's a pattern that we would all come to agree on. The patterns that we submit to now, we submit to externally, heteronomously, to use the fancy word. In other words, they're external to us. They did not ask for us to ratify them, or to whether or not we accepted them or not. And this is, by the way, goes back to the whole idea, is society really an aggregate of individuals? I think society is not an aggregate. I think that's the modern myth. I think society is organismic, and we as individuals come out of that structure. So pattern is the opposite of chaos. The question is whether the patterns that we live under are democratically constituted or imposed. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, and I'm going to lower this so I can see you. Great. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm thinking about what you said about cohorts, and I think I'm looking around the room, and I think we belong to a cohort that is very activist. I'm thinking of looking at Danny, Extinction Rebellion. I was a chaplain at Occupy Wall Street. I'm on Columbia and NYU campuses, and my cohorts there are different than your students. So I think it's wonderful. Well, wonderful. It's good that you told us about these different cohorts, because I think when we're here together in our community, we maybe get a little depressed, but I think we don't realize the extent of it. And I think you're right in terms of motivating us to know about that. I hope will light a fire under us even more. And one of those fires that I want to light with you right now is our shared collection. And that is our social service board. And I'm looking at